A wealthy businessman strikes a deal with a homeless woman to carry his child, expecting nothing more than a simple transaction. But when the twins are born, what he sees leaves him completely stunned. The grand office of Henry Carter was a testament to his success. Sleek mahogany furniture gleamed under soft lighting, while floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the bustling city below. At 42 years old, Henry was the epitome of self-made wealth, a man who had clawed his way from humble beginnings to the pinnacle of success. Yet, amidst the trappings of his luxurious life, a deep void lingered, gnawing at him in moments of solitude. Tonight that void was particularly sharp. Seated behind his pristine desk, Henry swirled a glass of whiskey in his hand, his sharp eyes staring at nothing in particular. On the surface, he seemed to have it all: power, respect, and a life of unbridled luxury. But in the silence of his expansive penthouse, the truth was unavoidable. His life felt incomplete. Despite his countless achievements, there was no one to inherit his legacy. No heir to carry forward his name, his empire, his meticulously built world. Henry leaned back, his thoughts drifting to the past. His 2 failed marriages played like a reel in his mind, each one a reminder of his inability, or perhaps unwillingness, to form lasting connections. Love, as far as he was concerned, was an illusion, an entanglement that clouded judgment and led to disappointment. He had tried twice, and both times he had been burned. But a child? That was different. A child wasn't about love or companionship. A child was an investment, an extension of himself, someone to carry on his empire and ensure that all he had built wouldn't fade into obscurity. The idea had been forming in his mind for months, but tonight it solidified into a decision. He would have an heir, on his terms. No emotions, no relationships, just a business transaction. Henry set his glass down and pressed a button on his desk. Moments later, his assistant Stephanie appeared in the doorway. "You called, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her tone professional as always. "Yes, Stephanie. Schedule a meeting with our legal team tomorrow morning. I need a contract drawn up," he said, his voice firm and deliberate. Stephanie raised an eyebrow but knew better than to ask questions. "Understood. Is there anything else?" "No, that's all for tonight," Henry replied, dismissing her with a nod. As she left, Henry leaned forward, his hands clasped together. He wasn't looking for love, nor did he want the complications of a traditional family. What he needed was a clear agreement, a contract that would ensure he retained control over the entire process. "This time," he murmured to himself, "there will be no mistakes." Later that evening, as the city lights flickered outside his penthouse, Henry began researching surrogacy and other unconventional options. His mind worked like a machine, calculating risks, outcomes, and logistics. But amidst his meticulous planning, a faint shadow of doubt crept into his thoughts. Could he truly separate himself from the emotional ties of parenthood? Would his plan succeed without complications? He brushed the doubts aside. Henry Carter wasn't a man who entertained uncertainty. He had a goal, and he would achieve it, just as he had with every other challenge in his life. As the hours ticked by and the city grew quiet, Henry closed his laptop and leaned back in his chair. His plan was set in motion, but little did he know, the journey ahead would challenge everything he believed about control, connection, and the true meaning of family. The streets were alive with the hum of the city as Henry Carter's sleek black sports car glided through the bustling downtown. The rhythmic tapping of his fingers against the leather steering wheel mirrored his growing impatience. He had spent the morning in meetings, finalizing plans for his unconventional path to parenthood, and now he was eager to return to his meticulously organized penthouse to unwind. But as he slowed for a red light, something unusual caught his attention. On the sidewalk to his right, a young woman sat cross-legged on the ground, her head bent over a sheet of paper. Her messy brown hair fell in uneven strands around her face, and her clothes, worn and mismatched, hung loosely on her frame. Despite her disheveled appearance, there was an air of determination about her as she moved her pencil across the paper with focused precision. Most people passed by without a second glance, but Henry found himself lingering, his eyes narrowing in curiosity. She was drawing, seemingly oblivious to the noise and chaos around her. The light turned green, and the car behind Henry honked impatiently. With a grunt, he pressed the accelerator and sped away. A few blocks down, Henry pulled into a parking lot and turned off the engine. His mind kept returning to the woman on the sidewalk. Who sketches in the middle of a crowded street as if the world around them doesn't exist? Annoyed with himself for caring, he sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, shaking his head. But the thought wouldn't leave him. Finally, with a huff of exasperation, he restarted the car and drove back to the intersection. There she was, still in the same spot, her pencil moving deftly across the paper. This time, he pulled up to the curb, rolled down the window, and called out, "Hey you, come here!" The woman's head shot up, her blue eyes narrowing as she looked at him. Suspicion etched her face as she hesitated, her body stiffening. "I'm not asking again," Henry added, his tone firm. "I don't have all day." Reluctantly, she stood and approached the car, her arms crossed defensively. Up close, her thin frame and tired features were more evident. Despite her guarded posture, her eyes held a spark of defiance. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Henry studied her for a moment before replying, "Get in, I want to talk." The woman laughed dryly, her suspicion intensifying. "I'm not that kind of girl if that's what you're thinking." He frowned, irritation flashing across his face. "Don't be absurd. I have no interest in that. I want to talk. Nothing else. Now, you can either get in the car and hear me out, or you can go back to sketching on the sidewalk. Your choice." The woman hesitated, her eyes darting between Henry's stern expression and the street around her. Finally, she sighed and opened the passenger door, sliding in cautiously. The interior of the car, with its sleek leather seats and immaculate design, seemed a world away from the streets she had come from. They drove in silence, the tension between them palpable. Henry finally pulled into a quiet cafe and parked. Without a word, he led her inside, choosing a table in the corner away from prying eyes. "What's your name?" he asked as they sat down. Mia Davis," she replied, her tone guarded. "Why does it matter?" "Because I need to know who I'm dealing with," he replied curtly. "Tell me, Mia, why do you sit on a sidewalk drawing as if nothing else matters?" She shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "What else is there to do? I have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Drawing keeps me sane. It's not much, but it's mine." Henry leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Then I'm about to give you an option that changes everything." Mia's eyes narrowed as she studied him. "What kind of option?" He hesitated for a brief moment, knowing how absurd his next words would sound. "I want you to have my child." Mia blinked, her mouth falling open slightly. For a moment she thought she had misheard him. "What?" she said, her voice laced with disbelief. "I'm serious," Henry said, his tone as steady as ever. "I'll provide everything you need, housing, medical care, and financial security. In exchange, you'll carry my child. After the birth, you'll receive a substantial sum to start a new life. No strings attached." Mia let out a sharp laugh, leaning back in her chair. "You're joking. You have to be joking." "I don't joke about serious matters," Henry replied. "This is a straightforward arrangement. No emotions, no relationships, just a contract." Mia stared at him as if he'd lost his mind. "You're insane. You don't even know me, and you think I'd agree to something like that?" Henry's gaze remained fixed on her, unyielding. "I don't need to know you. All I need is your agreement. You said you have nowhere to go, no one to turn to. I'm offering you a way out, a chance at stability." Mia's jaw tightened. She wanted to dismiss him, to call him crazy and walk away. But his words struck a chord. The streets had worn her down, each day a battle to survive. The promise of security, even if it came with such an outlandish condition, was tempting. "And if I say no?" she challenged. "Then you go back to the streets," Henry replied bluntly. "You keep scraping by, facing the cold and hunger every day. The choice is yours." His words landed like a blow, their brutal honesty cutting through her defenses. She hated that he was right, that her options were so limited. But agreeing to such a proposition felt like giving up a piece of herself. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded. "You're rich, powerful. Why not just adopt or hire someone else? Why me?" Henry's expression hardened. "Because I want an heir of my own blood, and because I see potential in you, Mia. You're stronger than you realize." The sincerity in his voice surprised her. For a moment she saw a glimmer of something beneath his cold, calculated exterior. Something human. "I need time to think," Mia said finally, her voice quieter now. "You have 24 hours, Henry replied, standing up. "After that, the offer is off the table." He left the cafe without another word, leaving Mia sitting alone with her thoughts. The enormity of the decision loomed over her, and as she stared out the window at the city lights, she realized that her life was about to change one way or another. Mia barely slept that night. The weight of Henry's proposition pressed on her like a heavy fog, filling her mind with questions she couldn't answer. The idea of carrying a stranger's child for money felt surreal, even disturbing. Yet, as she sat on the cold steps of the abandoned building she called home, staring at the empty streets, she couldn't deny the pull of the opportunity he offered. The promise of stability, safety, and a fresh start was hard to ignore. Her stomach growled, a stark reminder of how close she was to the edge. Mia clutched the thin blanket around her shoulders, her mind racing. Could she really say no to a way out? By morning, her decision was made. Henry was already seated in his spacious office when Mia arrived, guided by his assistant, a poised woman named Stephanie. The floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the room in sunlight, highlighting the modern, minimalist decor that reflected Henry's personality. Cold, calculated, and meticulously controlled. Mia stood awkwardly in the doorway, clutching the strap of her worn canvas bag. Her nervousness was evident, but she masked it with a look of defiance. "You came," Henry said, rising from his desk. He gestured to a chair opposite him. "Sit." She hesitated, her gaze flicking to the polished desk, the gleaming awards on the shelves, and finally to Henry himself. He was dressed impeccably, his sharp suit a stark contrast to her rumpled clothes. With a deep breath, she took a seat. "I thought about what you said," she began, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. "And I've decided I'll do it." Henry gave a curt nod, showing no sign of surprise. "Good. Then let's get straight to business." He opened a sleek leather folder on his desk, revealing a thick document. "This is the contract. My lawyers have drafted it to cover every detail of the arrangement." Mia leaned forward, her eyes scanning the pages. The text was dense, filled with legal jargon she barely understood. As if sensing her hesitation, Henry spoke again. "I'll walk you through the key points," he said, flipping to a section he had bookmarked. "You'll move into my home, where all your needs will be provided for: housing, food, medical care, and any personal necessities. In return, you agree to carry the pregnancy to term and relinquish all parental rights to the child once they are born." He turned another page, his tone matter-of-fact. "After the birth, you'll receive a sum of $500,000, transferred to an account of your choice. This will be your opportunity to start over. To ensure transparency, everything is legally binding. No changes can be made once the contract is signed." Mia's heart raced as she listened. The terms were clear, but the reality of what she was agreeing to felt overwhelming. "What if something goes wrong?" she asked, her voice quieter now. Henry didn't flinch. "If there are medical complications, you'll be provided with the best care available. And if you choose to back out after signing—" He paused, his eyes locking onto hers. "You won't be entitled to the payment." Mia swallowed hard. "And the baby? What happens to them?" Henry's expression softened, if only slightly. "The child will be raised in my care, with every advantage money can provide. I have no intention of neglecting my responsibilities." The answer wasn't comforting, but it was enough. Mia leaned back, the enormity of the decision weighing heavily on her. She had one more question. "Why me?" she asked, her gaze unwavering. "Out of all the people you could have chosen, why did you pick me?" Henry hesitated, the first crack in his composed demeanor. "Because you're different," he said finally. "You've endured more than most people could imagine, yet here you are, still fighting. I respect that." His words hung in the air, and for the first time, Mia felt a flicker of understanding between them. She wasn't just a random choice. He had seen something in her that even she struggled to recognize. "I need you to sign here," Henry said, pushing the contract toward her and offering a sleek pen. Mia stared at the dotted line, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the pen. Her mind raced with thoughts of what this would mean, how her life would change. But as she glanced back at Henry, she saw no hesitation in his eyes, only a man who knew exactly what he wanted. With a deep breath, she signed her name. The moment the pen left the paper, Mia felt a strange mix of relief and fear. It was done. There was no turning back now. Henry stood, extending a hand. "Stephanie will show you to your new accommodations. You'll move in today." "Today?" Mia asked, startled. "Yes," he said firmly. "The sooner we begin, the better. Stephanie will handle everything." Stephanie appeared in the doorway, her professional demeanor unshaken. "Follow me," she said with a polite smile. Mia followed her out of the office, casting one last glance at Henry. He was already back at his desk, reviewing another set of documents, as if what had just happened was no more significant than any other transaction. As Mia stepped into the elevator, her thoughts swirled. She had just traded her body and a piece of her future for a chance at stability. She couldn't tell if she had made the best decision of her life or the worst. But one thing was certain, her world would never be the same. Mia gripped the leather seat of the luxury car as it cruised through the tree-lined roads. The ride to Henry's mansion felt surreal, the reality of her decision sinking in with each passing mile. Stephanie, seated beside her, tried to make small talk, but Mia was too consumed by her thoughts to respond with more than a nod or a hum. The car finally slowed as they approached an imposing iron gate. It swung open silently, revealing a sprawling estate that looked like it belonged in a movie. The mansion stood at the center, a marvel of marble and glass, surrounded by perfectly manicured gardens and a fountain that sparkled under the afternoon sun. Mia swallowed hard, clutching her worn canvas bag tighter. She felt out of place like a smudge on a pristine canvas. Stephanie, ever composed, turned to her with a reassuring smile. "This is where you'll be staying," she said as the car came to a stop in front of the grand entrance. "I'll show you to your room." Mia stepped out of the car, her sneakers crunching against the gravel driveway. She followed Stephanie into the mansion, her eyes wide as they took in the sheer opulence of her surroundings. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings. Marble floors gleamed under soft lighting, and every piece of furniture looked as though it cost more than her entire life savings. "This way," Stephanie said, leading Mia up a sweeping staircase and down a long corridor. They stopped in front of a double door. Stephanie opened it, revealing a bedroom that took Mia's breath away. The room was enormous, with a king-sized bed covered in silk sheets, floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the gardens, and a bathroom larger than any apartment Mia had ever lived in. A vase of fresh flowers sat on a polished wood table, and plush rugs softened the hardwood floors. "This will be your room," Stephanie said, gesturing for Mia to step inside. "If you need anything, just press the call button by the bed. Someone will assist you." Mia nodded mutely, still processing the sheer size and luxury of the space. It felt more like a hotel suite than a room in someone's home. "I'll leave you to settle in," Stephanie said, turning to leave. She paused at the door. "And don't worry about anything. We're here to take care of you." As the door closed behind her, Mia dropped her bag on the bed and looked around. The silence of the room was almost deafening. She wandered to the window, gazing out at the sprawling gardens below. It was beautiful, no doubt, but it didn't feel real. Nothing about this place felt real. That evening, Mia was invited to dinner in the formal dining room. She hesitated at first, unsure if she could face Henry again so soon, but Stephanie's gentle insistence left her no choice. The dining room was just as extravagant as the rest of the mansion. A long table, polished to perfection, stretched almost the length of the room, set with fine china and crystal glasses. Henry sat at the head of the table, his posture as impeccable as his tailored suit. Mia entered hesitantly, feeling the weight of his gaze as he looked up from his plate. "Good evening," he said, his tone even. "Evening," Mia replied quietly, taking a seat near the middle of the table, as far from him as she could manage without being rude. Henry studied her for a moment, before turning his attention back to his meal. The staff served her a plate of food that looked too fancy to touch, let alone eat. Mia stared at it, her appetite non-existent, despite how hungry she had been earlier. "This must feel overwhelming," Henry said suddenly, breaking the silence. Mia looked up, startled. He wasn't looking at her, his focus still on his food, but his tone carried a rare hint of understanding. "It does," she admitted after a pause. "I've never been anywhere like this." "It takes some getting used to," he said, finally meeting her gaze. "But you'll adjust." Mia wasn't sure how to respond, so she nodded and picked at her food. The rest of the meal passed in near silence, the only sounds the clinking of utensils and the quiet footsteps of the staff. The early weeks of Mia's stay at the mansion were a haze of routine. Doctor visits, strict meal plans, and solitude filled her days, but as time passed, the edges of her discomfort softened. She began to explore the house more freely and occasionally joined the staff in small conversations. However, her interactions with Henry remained distant, confined to polite nods and brief exchanges. One morning, Mia found herself in the garden, drawn by the sound of birdsong. The neatly arranged flower beds and the gentle murmur of a fountain created a serene atmosphere. She sat on a wooden bench near the fountain, sketchbook in hand, attempting to capture the intricate patterns of the petals. Lost in her work, she didn't notice Henry approaching until his shadow fell across her page. "Good morning," Henry said, his voice even as always. His presence startled her, but she quickly regained her composure. "Good morning," she replied, closing her sketchbook instinctively. He noticed the movement and raised an eyebrow. "You draw?" "Sometimes," she admitted, her tone cautious. "It helps me clear my head." Henry hesitated for a moment before sitting down on the opposite end of the bench. His gaze swept over the garden before returning to her. "May I see?" Mia blinked, unsure if she'd heard him correctly. There was a softness in his request that she hadn't expected. Slowly, she reopened the sketchbook and handed it to him. He flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. "You're talented," he said finally, his tone matter-of-fact. "Why didn't you pursue this?" Mia looked away, her fingers nervously playing with the edge of her sleeve. "Life had other plans." Henry seemed to consider her response. After a moment, he handed the sketchbook back. "You should keep drawing. It's good to have something that's yours." Mia nodded, unsure how to respond. His comment lingered in her mind long after he'd left. A week later, during one of Mia's routine medical checkups, Henry surprised her by showing up unannounced. He entered the room just as the doctor was preparing the ultrasound machine, his expression neutral but his presence commanding. "Mr. Carter," the doctor greeted him, visibly caught off guard. "I wasn't expecting you." "I wanted to check on the progress myself," Henry replied, his tone firm. Mia looked at him, her surprise evident. "You didn't have to come." "I know," he said simply, taking a seat near the monitor. As the doctor applied the gel and began the scan, the sound of the baby's heartbeat filled the room. Mia's breath caught in her throat, her eyes fixed on the screen as the rhythmic sound reverberated in her ears. She felt a rush of emotion, a connection to the life growing inside her that she couldn't quite put into words. Henry, too, seemed momentarily taken aback. His gaze remained fixed on the screen, his usual stoic expression softening. "That's remarkable," he murmured almost to himself. Mia glanced at him, noting the way his posture had relaxed, his hands no longer clasped tightly in front of him. For the first time, she saw a glimpse of vulnerability in the man who always seemed so controlled. After the appointment, they walked to the car in silence. Henry opened the door for her, a gesture that felt oddly personal. "Thank you for coming," Mia said as she got in, her voice quiet. Henry nodded, his expression thoughtful. It felt important. From that point on, Henry's demeanor toward Mia began to shift. He started joining her for meals more often, asking about her day and occasionally engaging in conversations that went beyond surface-level politeness. He noticed her preferences, how she liked her tea, the way she always added a touch of cinnamon to her oatmeal, and made subtle adjustments to accommodate them. Mia, in turn, found herself lowering her guard. She shared snippets of her past, her love for art, the struggles that had led her to the streets, and was surprised by Henry's genuine interest. Though he rarely spoke about himself, his attentive listening made her feel heard for the first time in years. One evening, as Mia was sketching in the study, Henry walked in with a small box in his hand. He placed it on the table beside her without a word. "What's this?" she asked, looking up at him. "Open it," he said simply. Inside, she found a set of high-quality paints and brushes, along with a blank canvas. Her eyes widened as she looked up at him. "You didn't have to." "I wanted to," he interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. "You said drawing helps you. Consider it an investment." Mia smiled, a genuine warmth spreading through her chest. "Thank you." Henry nodded, his lips curving into the faintest hint of a smile before he turned and left the room. As the weeks turned into months, Mia and Henry began to share more moments like these. Their interactions, once transactional and distant, started to carry an undercurrent of trust and understanding. It wasn't a dramatic change, just small gestures and conversations that slowly chipped away at the walls they'd both built around themselves. One rainy afternoon, as they sat in the living room listening to the soft patter of rain against the windows, Mia found herself laughing at one of Henry's dry, unexpected jokes. The sound startled her, and she quickly clapped a hand over her mouth. Henry raised an eyebrow. "What?" "Nothing," she said, shaking her head. "I just didn't think you had a sense of humor." His lips twitched into a faint smile. "Don't get used to it." For the first time, Mia allowed herself to hope that their arrangement might lead to something more than just a contract. Though neither of them said it out loud, the bonds forming between them were undeniable. In the quiet moments they shared, amidst the laughter and the heartbeat of the life they'd created, a fragile but profound connection began to take root. The weeks seemed to blur together as Mia adjusted to her new life and the reality of her pregnancy. With each passing day, her connection to the child growing inside her deepened, though she remained careful not to show too much emotion in front of Henry. She knew their arrangement was transactional, and any sign of attachment might complicate things. Yet she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope that her future held more than the confines of the agreement. One morning, Mia sat in the sunlit kitchen sipping herbal tea while flipping through one of the art books Henry had gifted her. Stephanie, Henry's assistant, appeared at the door with her usual clipboard in hand. "Ready for today's checkup?" Stephanie asked, her tone bright. Mia nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." The routine of medical visits had become familiar, but today felt different. Mia couldn't pinpoint why, but an undercurrent of unease settled in her chest as she got into the car. Henry joined her, as he often did now, his presence stoic but somehow reassuring. The drive to the doctor's office was quiet, save for the occasional hum of the car engine. Henry glanced at Mia once, noting the slight tension in her posture. "Nervous?" he asked, his voice calm. "A little," she admitted, turning to look out the window. "I just want everything to be okay." "It will be," he said simply, his tone leaving no room for doubt. At the clinic, Mia lay back on the examination table as the doctor prepped the ultrasound machine. Henry stood near the door, his arms crossed but his eyes fixed on her, watching for any sign of discomfort. The doctor adjusted the machine, and soon the room filled with the familiar sound of the baby's heartbeat. Mia's lips curved into a small smile, the rhythmic sound grounding her in the moment. "Let's take a closer look," the doctor said, moving the transducer across Mia's abdomen. He squinted slightly at the screen before his expression shifted into one of pleasant surprise. "Well, this is unexpected." "What is it?" Mia asked, her voice tinged with worry. The doctor turned to her with a reassuring smile. "You're not having just one baby, you're having twins." Mia's eyes widened and her breath hitched. "Twins?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry, who had been standing quietly in the corner, straightened. For the first time, his composed demeanor cracked, his eyebrows shooting up in shock. "Twins," he echoed, stepping closer to the screen. "Yes," the doctor confirmed, pointing to the monitor. "Here's baby A and here's baby B. Both are developing well and are perfectly healthy." Mia stared at the screen, her emotions swirling in a chaotic storm. The idea of carrying one child had been daunting enough, but two. She placed a hand on her belly, feeling the weight of the revelation settle over her. Henry remained silent, his eyes fixed on the monitor. The cold logic that usually guided him seemed to falter as he processed the news. 2 children. 2 lives that would carry his name, his legacy. It was more than he had planned for, and the unexpected complexity left him momentarily speechless. On the drive back to the mansion, the air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Mia kept her gaze on the passing scenery, her hand resting protectively on her stomach. Henry, seated beside her, appeared lost in his own world, his usually sharp eyes clouded with contemplation. "Are you okay?" he asked abruptly, breaking the silence. Mia turned to him, surprised by the question. "I think so," she said slowly. "It's just a lot to take in." Henry nodded, his expression softening slightly. For me, too, his admission caught her off guard. It was rare for him to show vulnerability, and she realized that the news of the twins had shaken him as much as it had her. For the first time, they seemed to be on equal footing, two people navigating an unexpected reality together. That evening, Mia retreated to her room, her thoughts a tangle of fear and wonder. She opened her sketchbook hoping to find solace in drawing, but her hand faltered. Every line she attempted seemed inadequate to capture the enormity of what she felt. A soft knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. "Come in," she called, her voice weary. Henry stepped inside, his usual commanding presence tempered by a rare hesitancy. He held a tray with 2 cups of tea, setting it down on the small table by the window. "I thought you might need this," he said, sitting across from her. Mia blinked, surprised by the gesture. "Thank you." They sat in silence for a while, the warmth of the tea providing a small comfort. Finally, Henry spoke. "This changes things," he said, his tone measured. "Twins weren't part of the plan." "No, they weren't," Mia agreed, her voice quieter. "But maybe that's not a bad thing," he continued, surprising her. "Life doesn't always follow a script. Sometimes the unexpected leads to something better." Mia looked at him, searching his face for any hint of insincerity, but found none. "Do you really believe that?" she asked. He hesitated before nodding. "I'm starting to." For the first time, Mia felt a sense of camaraderie with Henry. The twins, though unplanned, had created a bond between them, one rooted in the shared responsibility of the lives they were bringing into the world. It wasn't love, but it was something, and for now that was enough. As Mia's pregnancy progressed, the atmosphere in the mansion became increasingly complex. Henry, who had always kept his emotions carefully guarded, began to show cracks in his stoic exterior. His once detached demeanor shifted. He started appearing at more of Mia's medical appointments, asking questions about the twins' development, and lingering longer during their conversations. However, his growing involvement only seemed to amplify the tension between them. One evening, as Mia rested in the lounge, Henry entered the room, his expression unusually pensive. He cleared his throat before speaking. "Are you comfortable here?" he asked, his voice softer than usual. Mia looked up, surprised by the question. "As comfortable as I can be in a place that isn't mine," she replied honestly. Henry flinched slightly, her words hitting a nerve. "You have everything you need here. If there's something lacking, just let me know." Mia sighed, setting aside the book she was pretending to read. "It's not about things, Henry. It's the reality of what's happening. I'm carrying these children, but I'm also counting down the days until I have to give them up." The bluntness of her statement seemed to catch Henry off guard. For a moment he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the floor. Then, almost hesitantly, he admitted, "I didn't think it would be this complicated." Mia raised an eyebrow. "What did you expect, Henry? That this would be just another business deal for you to manage?" "Yes," he admitted, his tone clipped. "That's exactly what I thought. But it's not, is it? I see that now." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Mia saw something close to vulnerability in him. She wanted to push him further, to ask what had changed, but she held back. It wasn't her place, and she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. The tension came to a head during a routine checkup. As the doctor explained the latest updates about the twins, Mia noticed Henry's growing unease. When they returned to the mansion, his frustration spilled over. "This wasn't supposed to be this messy," he said, pacing the room. "It was supposed to be simple." Mia watched him, her patience wearing thin. "Life isn't simple, Henry, especially not when it involves real people and real emotions." He stopped pacing and looked at her, his expression a mix of guilt and frustration. "I know that now. But I'm trying, Mia. I don't know how to do this. Any of this." His admission caught her off guard. For a man who seemed to have every aspect of his life meticulously planned, the idea that he didn't know how to navigate this situation made him seem almost human. but Mia wasn't ready to let her guard down. "Then figure it out," she said, her tone firm but not unkind, "because these babies deserve more than a man who only sees them as part of a plan." Henry didn't respond immediately. Instead, he nodded slightly, as if her words had struck a chord, and left the room. In the weeks that followed, their dynamic remained strained, but began to shift. Henry continued to show up for appointments and even started asking Mia about her thoughts on names for the twins. Though their conversations were often stilted, Mia couldn't ignore the effort he was making. One afternoon, as she sat sketching in the garden, Henry approached her with 2 cups of tea. He handed one to her without a word and sat down on the bench beside her. "What are you working on?" he asked, glancing at her sketchbook. Mia hesitated before showing him. It was a rough drawing of the twins' ultrasound image, their tiny forms captured in delicate pencil strokes. Henry stared at the drawing for a long moment before speaking. "You're talented," he said quietly. "They're lucky to have a mother like you." Mia blinked, caught off guard by the compliment. "I won't be their mother for long," she replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Henry's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he said, "That doesn't mean you don't matter to them." The silence that followed was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. For the first time, Mia felt that Henry was beginning to understand the gravity of the situation, not just for her, but for himself as well. As the weeks turned into months, the lines between obligation and genuine connection began to blur. Henry's attempts to reconcile his original intentions with his growing attachment to the twins and to Mia were obvious. And though Mia tried to protect her heart, she couldn't help but notice that the man she had once dismissed as cold and calculating was slowly beginning to change. The final weeks of Mia's pregnancy were a whirlwind of anticipation, fear, and growing emotions. As her due date loomed closer, the dynamics between her and Henry shifted in ways neither of them had anticipated. The morning began like any other, with the household bustling quietly around Mia. Stephanie had left instructions for the staff to ensure Mia's comfort at all times. The nursery, once a stark and functional room, was now a cozy haven filled with warm pastel colors, soft toys, and an impressive array of baby essentials. Henry had overseen every detail, though he rarely spoke about it. Mia stood in the nursery, her hands gently resting on her swollen belly as she took in the sight of 2 tiny cribs. She ran her fingers along the edge of the nearest one, her mind swirling with thoughts about the life she was about to bring into the world, and the inevitable goodbye she would have to say. The sound of the door opening pulled her from her thoughts. Henry stepped inside, his tie slightly askew, his expression unusually soft. "Everything ready?" he asked, his eyes scanning the room. "As ready as it'll ever be," Mia replied with a small smile. "You've thought of everything, haven't you?" Henry nodded, his gaze briefly meeting hers. "I wanted to make sure they have everything they need." "They will," Mia said softly, her voice tinged with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Henry hesitated, then walked over to stand beside her. "And you? Are you okay?" Mia blinked in surprise. It wasn't like Henry to ask such a personal question, but there was a sincerity in his tone that caught her off guard. "I'm scared," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Not about the birth, but about what comes after." Henry's jaw tightened. "I've been thinking about that too." She turned to look at him, her brow furrowed. And I don't have all the answers," he said honestly. "But I know that whatever happens, I want to do right by you and the twins." Mia wanted to believe him, but the uncertainty of their arrangement still loomed large. Before she could respond, a sharp pain shot through her abdomen, causing her to gasp and clutch her belly. "Mia?" Henry's voice was filled with alarm as he reached out to steady her. "I think it's time," she said, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The ride to the hospital was tense. Henry sat beside Mia in the back seat of the car, his hand hovering near hers but not quite touching. He was clearly out of his element, and for once the usually composed businessman seemed unsure of what to do. "You'll be fine," he said, more to himself than to Mia. Mia managed a weak smile through the pain. "I've gotten through worse." Henry's lips twitched into a fleeting smile, but his worry was evident. As the car pulled up to the hospital, a team of doctors and nurses was already waiting, thanks to Stephanie's meticulous planning. The hours that followed were a blur of activity. Mia was wheeled into the delivery room, her contractions growing more intense. Henry refused to leave her side, despite the doctor's suggestions that he wait outside. "I'm staying," he said firmly, his tone brooking no argument. Mia, though exhausted, found comfort in his presence. She gripped his hand tightly through each contraction, her strength and determination evident despite the pain. When the first baby's cry filled the room, Mia's tears mingled with a relieved laugh. "It's a boy," the doctor announced, holding up the tiny newborn before placing him on Mia's chest. Mia looked down at the wriggling baby, overwhelmed by a wave of love she hadn't expected. Henry stood frozen beside her, his eyes locked on the tiny life he had helped create. Before they could fully process the moment, another cry filled the room. "It's a girl," the doctor said, handing the second baby to a nurse for cleaning. Henry's breath hitched as he stared at the two babies. He had imagined this moment so many times, but the reality of it was far more overwhelming. These weren't just theoretical errors or pieces in a carefully calculated plan. They were his children. Mia sat in the nursery late one night, the soft glow of a nightlight illuminating her tired yet peaceful face. The twins, now a week old, were sleeping soundly in their cribs. She watched their tiny chests rise and fall, marveling at how something so small could fill her heart so completely. Yet as she gazed at them, the looming question of her future weighed heavily on her mind. Henry entered quietly, his usually sharp footsteps muffled by the plush rug. Mia looked up, startled, but he gestured for her to stay seated. "I didn't mean to interrupt," he said, his voice softer than usual. He walked over to the cribs, his gaze lingering on the twins. "They're beautiful." "They are," Mia replied, her voice thick with emotion. She turned her attention back to the babies, not wanting to meet Henry's eyes. She knew what he was here to discuss. Henry hesitated for a moment, then sat down in the chair across from her. "Mia," he began, his tone uncharacteristically hesitant, "I've been thinking a lot about everything, about us, the twins, and the agreement." Mia's heart sank. She knew this conversation was inevitable, but that didn't make it any easier. "You don't have to say anything, Henry. I know what I signed up for." "That's just it," Henry interrupted, leaning forward. "I don't think I do." Mia frowned, unsure of what he meant. "What are you talking about?" Henry took a deep breath, his usual calm and calculated demeanor replaced by something raw and vulnerable. "When we made this agreement, I thought I could keep everything simple. I thought I could treat this like any other deal, a transaction with clear terms and no emotional ties, but I was wrong." Mia's eyes widened in surprise. "Henry, I don't want you to leave," he said bluntly, his gaze locking onto hers. "Not because of the contract, not because of some obligation. I want you to stay because you and the twins, you've become more than I ever thought possible." Mia's breath caught, her heart racing. She had dreamed of hearing those words, but now that they were out in the open, she wasn't sure how to respond. "Henry, you can't just change the terms like this. It's not that simple." "I know it's not," he admitted, "but I also know that I don't want to lose what we've built here. I don't want to lose you." Mia felt a lump rise in her throat. She had spent so long guarding her heart, afraid to trust, afraid to hope. But Henry's vulnerability was undeniable, and it stirred something deep within her. "What if it doesn't work?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "What if we're just setting ourselves up for more pain?" Henry leaned closer, his expression earnest. "Then we'll figure it out, together. I'm not saying it'll be easy, but I'm willing to try if you are." Mia looked away, her emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She wanted to believe him, but the fear of being hurt again was hard to shake. "Henry, I've been let down so many times. How do I know you won't change your mind?" "You don't," he admitted, his voice steady. "But I promise you this. I'm not the same man I was when we made that contract. You've changed me, Mia. The twins have changed me. And I want to prove to you that I can be the man you and they deserve." For a long moment the room was silent, except for the soft hum of the nightlight. Mia's mind raced, torn between the safety of leaving and the hope of staying. She looked at Henry, his normally stoic face now etched with sincerity and vulnerability. He wasn't asking her to stay out of obligation. He was asking her to take a leap of faith. Finally, she nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Okay," she said, her voice trembling. "I'll stay. But Henry, this has to be real. No more walls, no more pretending. If we're going to do this, we have to do it together." Henry let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. "Together," he agreed, a small smile tugging at his lips. The following days marked the beginning of a new chapter for Mia and Henry. The contract that had once defined their relationship was torn up and discarded, replaced by a mutual commitment to building a life together. Henry, for the first time in years, allowed himself to be vulnerable, sharing pieces of his past and his fears. Mia, in turn, began to trust again, finding solace in Henry's growing dedication to her and the twins. They worked together to navigate their new reality, learning to co-parent and support one another. Henry's mansion, once cold and lifeless, became a home filled with laughter and warmth. Stephanie often remarked on the transformation, her own quiet satisfaction evident as she watched the family grow closer. One evening, as Mia rocked the twins to sleep, Henry entered the nursery with a rare, genuine smile. "You're incredible, you know that?" he said, leaning against the doorframe. Mia chuckled softly. "It's the twins. They make it easy to love them." Henry walked over and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "It's not just them, Mia. You've brought something into my life that I didn't even realize I was missing, and I'll spend the rest of my life making sure you know how much that means to me." For the first time in what felt like forever, Mia allowed herself to believe in a future filled with love and hope. As she and Henry stood together, watching their children sleep, she knew that while their journey had been anything but conventional, it had led them exactly where they were meant to be. The morning sun filtered through the large windows of Henry's mansion, casting a warm glow over the nursery. The twins, now a few weeks old, were stirring in their cribs, their soft coos and gurgles breaking the quiet. Mia stood at the window, her hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, gazing out at the sprawling garden. For the first time in a long while, she felt something she hadn't dared to hope for: peace. Henry entered the room quietly, his usual composed demeanor now softened by the scene before him. He picked up the baby boy, holding him gently as the infant stretched and yawned. Mia turned, smiling at the sight. It was still new to her, seeing Henry so at ease with the twins, but it was a welcome change. "Good morning," he said, his voice low and calm so as not to wake the other baby. "Good morning," Mia replied, setting her mug down and walking over to pick up the baby girl. "They're getting bigger every day." Henry nodded, his gaze fixed on his son. "It's amazing how much they change in such a short time. Sometimes I wonder if I'll blink and they'll already be grown." Mia chuckled softly. "That's parenthood, I guess. Constant change." The day unfolded quietly, filled with the small joys of caring for the twins. Henry, who had once been consumed by schedules and meetings, now made time to be present. He'd learned how to change diapers, warm bottles, and even soothe the babies when they fussed. His transformation hadn't been overnight, but it was genuine, and Mia found herself admiring the effort he put into becoming a hands-on father. Later that afternoon, the family gathered in the garden. A soft breeze rustled the trees as the twins lay on a blanket, kicking their tiny legs in the sunlight. Mia sat cross-legged beside them, sketching in the new sketchbook Henry had given her, while Henry watched with a contented smile. "You're talented," he said, nodding toward her drawing. Mia blushed, setting down her pencil. "It's just something I do to relax." "Well, you're good at it," he replied. "You should do more of it. Maybe even take it further." She looked at him, surprised. "You think so?" Henry nodded. "Why not? You've got the talent, and now you've got the support. There's no reason not to pursue it." That evening, after the twins were tucked into bed, Mia and Henry sat together on the couch in the living room. The fire crackled softly, casting a warm glow over the room. For the first time, the silence between them felt comfortable, unburdened by the weight of unspoken fears or uncertainties. "I've been thinking," Henry began, breaking the silence. Mia turned to him, her curiosity piqued. "About what?" "About the future," he said, his tone serious but not heavy. "I don't want us to just exist in this limbo, unsure of where we stand. I want us to build something real, a family, a life together." Mia's breath caught. She had suspected this was where their relationship was heading, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. "Henry, that's a big step. Are you sure?" He nodded without hesitation. "I've never been more sure of anything. Mia, you and the twins have changed everything for me. I thought I had it all figured out, but you've shown me that there's more to life than control and success. I don't want to lose that." Mia's heart swelled with emotion, but doubt lingered at the edges. "It won't be easy," she said softly. "We've been through so much already. What if it doesn't work out?" Henry reached for her hand, his gaze steady and sincere. "Then we'll face it together. Whatever challenges come our way, we'll deal with them as a team. I'm not going to give up on you, or us." Tears filled Mia's eyes as she nodded. "Okay," she whispered. "Let's do it." In the weeks that followed, Henry and Mia began to build the life they had both been missing. They worked together to create a home filled with warmth and love, one where the twins could thrive. Henry, true to his word, supported Mia as she began to explore her passion for art. He even cleared out a room in the mansion, turning it into a studio for her. Their days were filled with the chaos of parenting, midnight feedings, diaper changes, and endless lullabies, but also with moments of pure joy. The twins' laughter became the soundtrack of their lives, a constant reminder of the love that had brought them together. One evening, as the family sat in the garden watching the sunset, Henry turned to Mia. "I never imagined this is how my life would turn out," he said, his voice tinged with wonder. Mia smiled, resting her head on his shoulder. "Neither did I, but I'm glad it did." Henry looked down at the twins, who were snuggled together on the blanket. "I used to think that control was the only way to live, that emotions were a weakness. But you've taught me that it's okay to let go, to trust, to love. I can't thank you enough for that." Mia looked up at him, her eyes shining. "And you've shown me that even when life feels impossible, there's always a chance for something better. I never thought I'd find a home, or a family. But now, I can't imagine life without it." As the last rays of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Henry leaned down to kiss her gently. In that moment, surrounded by the love they had built, they both knew that their story was only just beginning. Together they would face whatever came next, knowing that they had found something worth fighting for. A family built not on contracts, but on love and trust. If this story inspired you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more uplifting stories that remind us of the power of humanity. Don't forget to share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. See you in the next video.